If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel for more captivating narratives that touch the heart and stir the soul. Now, let us begin our journey. The Grand Legacy Ballroom shimmered under the golden light of crystal chandeliers, a stark contrast to the grey November evening outside. Boston's elite mingled in their designer attire, champagne flutes clinking against the backdrop of polite conversation and forced laughter. The charity gala for the new Veteran Support Center had attracted the city's wealthiest, those whose generosity was often proportional to how visibly their names would be displayed on donor plaques. In the corner of the room stood an immaculate grand piano, its polished ebony surface reflecting the opulence surrounding it. The hired pianist had stepped away for a break, leaving the instrument momentarily silent amidst the social buzz. No one noticed the side door opening, allowing a gust of cold air and a disheveled figure to slip inside. Walter Hayes paused in the doorway, his weathered hands clutching the lapels of his tattered army jacket. The garment had once been crisp and dignified, much like the man who wore it, but years on the streets had left both frayed and forgotten. Walter's eyes, however, retained a clarity that seemed at odds with his appearance. They scanned the room methodically, the way he had once surveyed Afghan landscapes for potential threats. His gaze settled on the unattended piano, and something sparked in those deep blue eyes, something that had been dormant for years. Emily Carter balanced a tray of hors d'oeuvres with practiced precision. At 25, she moved through the crowd with the invisible efficiency expected of waitstaff. Few guests noticed the social work textbook peeking from her bag behind the service station, or the intelligent assessment in her eyes as she observed the wealthy patrons discussing the plight of veterans while sipping $100 glasses of champagne. "Excuse me, miss." Walter's voice was soft, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. "Is there someone I could speak to about playing that piano?" Emily's initial surprise at being addressed by the clearly homeless man quickly shifted to compassion. "I'm not sure that would be—" "I haven't eaten in 2 days," Walter continued, his dignity intact despite the admission. "I thought perhaps I could play in exchange for some food. I noticed there's plenty to spare." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward her supervisor who was engaged with demanding guests. "Let me see what I can do," she whispered, setting down her tray and heading toward the kitchen. Before she could return, Walter had already made his way to the buffet table, where Richard Thompson, the event's organizer and a prominent real estate developer, was holding court with several potential donors. "Sir," Walter addressed him directly, standing tall despite his worn appearance, "I was wondering if I might play the piano this evening, in exchange for a meal." The conversation around Richard halted. His expression shifted from surprise to disgust as he took in Walter's appearance, the unkempt beard, the army jacket with its faded insignia, the scuffed boots. "This is a private event," Richard announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "not a soup kitchen." His lips curled into a smirk as he looked to his companions for approval. Walter didn't flinch. "I'm a veteran, sir. I thought at a Veteran Support Center fundraiser there might be some consideration for those the center aims to serve." Richard's face flushed slightly, aware of the eyes now turning their way. He straightened his custom-tailored jacket and cleared his throat. "Well, isn't that convenient? A veteran appears just in time for dinner." The air quotes he formed around the word veteran hung heavy in the suddenly quiet space between them. Abraham Stevens, a silver-haired industrialist in his 70s, stepped forward from a nearby conversation. His expression was difficult to read, but the intensity of his gaze as it shifted between Walter and Richard suggested he found the exchange of particular interest. "Perhaps," Richard continued, his voice taking on a theatrical quality, "we should put your talents to the test." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $1,000 bill, holding it between two manicured fingers. "I propose a wager. If you can move someone in this room to tears with your playing, genuine tears, mind you, this money is yours." A collective murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Emily had returned in time to witness the cruel challenge, her face reflecting the indignity of the moment. Walter's eyes never left Richard's. "And if I fail?" Richard's smile widened. "Then you leave immediately and don't embarrass yourself or this event any further." Walter nodded once, a soldier accepting a mission. "I accept your terms, Mr. Thompson." "Richard Thompson," he replied with the confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized. "And you are?" "Walter Hayes." The name was spoken simply, without embellishment. As Walter turned and walked toward the piano, Emily caught a glimpse of his face. The resignation there was familiar to her from her fieldwork with homeless veterans, but beneath it burned something else, something she couldn't quite identify. The room watched as Walter settled himself at the bench, adjusting it with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the instrument. He removed his gloves, revealing hands that, despite their roughness, moved with unexpected grace as he lifted the cover from the keys. For a moment, Walter sat motionless, his fingers hovering above the ivory. The ballroom had fallen completely silent, the audience united in anticipation of what they assumed would be an awkward spectacle. Then, Walter Hayes began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor floated across the room like a question, soft and hesitant, before building into a cascade of emotion that seemed to transform the very air in the ballroom. Walter's fingers moved with a fluidity that defied the stiffness one would expect from hands that had known such hardship. Emily stood transfixed, her tray forgotten at her side. She watched as Walter's entire being seemed to meld with the instrument, his eyes closed, his weathered face reflecting each nuance of the piece as though the music were flowing through him rather than from him. The initial shock that rippled through the crowd at the unexpected display of virtuosity quickly gave way to something deeper. Conversations ceased entirely. Champagne flutes were lowered. All eyes turned to the homeless veteran whose music was rapidly dismantling every assumption they had made about him. Richard Thompson's smug expression faltered. He had expected a fumbling attempt at chopsticks, or perhaps a crude rendition of a popular tune. Instead, he was witnessing artistry of the highest caliber. His $1,000 bill was still clutched in his hand, but his knuckles had whitened around it. As the nocturne drew to its poignant close, Walter transitioned seamlessly into Debussy's Clair de Lune, his interpretation bringing out layers of meaning that even those familiar with the piece found revelatory. The music spoke of beauty amidst desolation, of moonlight breaking through storm clouds, of hope persisting in the darkest of times. A woman in a midnight blue gown pressed a silk handkerchief to her eyes. Across the room, a retired military officer stood rigidly, his jaw clenched against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Near the back of the gathered crowd, an elderly woman wept openly, making no attempt to hide the tears streaming down her face. Abraham Stevens had moved closer to the piano, his keen eyes never leaving Walter's face. There was recognition there now, and a profound sadness that seemed to age him beyond his years. When Walter concluded Clair de Lune, he paused, his hands resting lightly on the keys. The silence that followed was reverent, no one daring to break the spell he had cast over the room. Then, without preamble, Walter began an original composition, one that only a handful of people in the world would have recognized. It began with a melody that evoked the vastness of mountain landscapes, building gradually to incorporate rhythms reminiscent of military cadences and haunting phrases that hinted at ancient Afghan folk songs. Abraham Stevens visibly started at the first measures, his hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with an intensity that suggested he was fitting pieces of a puzzle together. The composition told a story without words, of brotherhood and sacrifice, of beauty found in unexpected places, and of losses too profound to articulate. As it reached its climax, more than a dozen guests were openly weeping, moved beyond their social composure by the raw emotion conveyed through Walter's playing. Richard Thompson stood frozen, the $1,000 bill forgotten in his hand. His face had lost its color, his earlier arrogance replaced by stunned disbelief. He looked around desperately, as though seeking someone who might explain what was happening. As the final notes of the composition faded, Walter remained still for a moment before opening his eyes. He looked not at Richard Thompson or at the tearful audience, but directly at Abraham Stevens. A moment of silent understanding passed between the two men, a recognition that transcended the present moment. Walter rose from the bench with quiet dignity. He turned to face the crowd, many of whom were still wiping away tears or standing in silent awe. Without a word, he walked toward Richard Thompson, his gait steady and purposeful. Richard extended the $1,000 bill automatically, his hand trembling slightly. Walter looked at it for a long moment, but made no move to take it. "Keep your money, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "It was never about that." The rejection seemed to snap Richard from his stupor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Really?" Before Walter could answer, Abraham Stevens stepped forward. "I believe I can answer that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hayes, recipient of the Medal of Honor and the most gifted pianist to ever come out of Juilliard." He turned to address the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just had the extraordinary privilege of hearing the pianist of the Ridge, a man many of us believed had perished years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan." The revelation sent shockwaves through the ballroom. Whispers rippled from guest to guest as they processed Abraham Stevens' words. Several military veterans in attendance straightened instinctively, a gesture of respect ingrained through years of service. "The pianist of the Ridge?" One woman questioned her companion. "I thought that was just a military legend." Emily stood motionless, her mind racing to connect the dots. As a social work student specializing in veteran services, she had studied the phenomenon of homeless veterans extensively, but this was beyond anything covered in her textbooks. She watched Walter's face, noticing how he neither confirmed nor denied Stevens' identification. Richard Thompson's composure crumbled further. "I don't understand," he said, looking between Walter and Abraham. "What is this? Some kind of elaborate stunt?" Abraham Stevens ignored him, focusing instead on Walter. "We thought you died, saving your unit," he said quietly. "The report said no one could have survived that ambush." Walter's expression remained carefully neutral. "Many didn't," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories too heavy to share. Richard, increasingly agitated by his loss of control over the situation, attempted to reassert himself. "Even if what Mr. Stevens says is true, it doesn't change the fact that you've crashed a private event." He gestured toward the door. "You've won your bet. Take the money and go." A murmur of disapproval rose from the crowd. Emily, unable to contain herself any longer, stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "do you understand what the Medal of Honor signifies?" She didn't wait for his response. "It's awarded for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of one's life, above and beyond the call of duty. If this man is who Mr. Stevens says he is, then he should be the guest of honor at this event, not treated like an intruder." Richard's face flushed, but before he could respond, Walter raised his hand slightly, a gesture that immediately commanded attention. "Thank you, miss," he said to Emily, his eyes reflecting genuine appreciation. "But there's no need to create further discord." He turned to Richard. "I didn't come here for recognition or charity. I came because I read about this Veterans Support Center in the newspaper, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of people were behind it." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken questions. Abraham Stevens moved closer, studying Walter with increasingly certain recognition. "It was Chopin's Second Sonata that gave you away," Stevens said softly. "The third movement. You always played it with that distinctive phrasing, like you were having a conversation with Chopin himself." He hesitated, then asked the question clearly burning in his mind. Why, Walter? Why let the world believe you were dead? Why? He gestured at Walter's disheveled appearance. This. Walter considered the question, his gaze sweeping across the ballroom, taking in the lavish decorations, the expensive attire, the remnants of uneaten food on abandoned plates. When I returned from Afghanistan, he began, his voice level but carrying to every corner of the now silent room, I found myself unable to reconnect with the world I had left behind. The contrast between the mountains, where I had seen both the worst and the best of humanity, and the comfortable indifference of civilian life, was overwhelming. He paused, his eyes briefly distant before refocusing. My identity as the pianist of the Ridge had become a symbol, something larger than myself. I found I couldn't bear the weight of it, so I stepped away, completely. But to become homeless? Abraham pressed gently. With your talents, your recognition. I didn't start out on the streets, Walter clarified. I tried to reintegrate. I taught piano to children for a while, played in restaurants. But the memories, the sounds. He left the thought unfinished, but many understood. Post-traumatic stress disorder was a reality many veterans faced, though few civilians truly comprehended its depths. Eventually, he continued, I found more peace in simplicity, in removing myself from expectations, from constant reminders of who I had been, and yes, from the nightmares that came with those reminders. He looked directly at Abraham. On the streets, no one asks for your story. No one expects you to be extraordinary. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. In her studies and fieldwork, she had encountered many veterans whose exceptional service had been followed by extraordinary struggles. Walter's story, while unique in its details, reflected a pattern she had seen repeatedly. Heroes who had given everything for their country only to find themselves adrift when they returned. Abraham Stevens nodded slowly, a depth of understanding in his eyes that suggested personal familiarity with such struggles. And now, why reveal yourself tonight, after all this time? Walter turned back toward the piano, running his fingers lightly over the polished wood. I didn't intend to, but when Mr. Thompson made his challenge, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. Music has always been my truest voice. Once I began to play, hiding was no longer possible. Richard Thompson, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, attempted once more to regain control of the situation. This is all very touching, he said, his voice brittle, but we still have a fundraiser to conduct. If you'll excuse us, Colonel Hayes. Lieutenant Colonel, Walter corrected mildly. Lieutenant Colonel, Richard amended impatiently. Perhaps we could arrange for you to receive some assistance from the center once it's operational. But for now, Abraham Stevens interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of his considerable social standing. Richard, for God's sake, show some decency. This man is a national hero. A hero who chose to disappear, Richard countered. Who, by his own admission, has been living as a vagrant. Hardly the image we want associated with our center. The cruelty of the statement hung in the air. Emily opened her mouth to object, but Walter spoke first. Your center, Mr. Thompson? He asked quietly. Richard straightened his tie. I am the chairman of the fundraising committee. This event is my initiative. Walter nodded thoughtfully. I see. And who is the primary donor? That information is confidential, Richard replied stiffly. We have several major contributors who prefer to remain anonymous, including the one who donated $5 million as a founding gift? Walter asked. A hush fell over the crowd. Richard's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. How could you possibly know about that? Walter didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his tattered jacket and withdrew a folded document. I believe this might interest you, Mr. Thompson. Richard took the document with visible reluctance, unfolding it with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents, his face draining of color. This is a copy of the trust agreement establishing the $5 million endowment for the Veterans Support Center, Walter confirmed. You'll note the signature on the last page. Richard flipped frantically to the final page. His knees seemed to buckle slightly as he read the name there. Walter Hayes, he whispered, disbelief evident in every syllable. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with astonishment. That's impossible, Richard stammered. The donor worked through layers of attorneys. There was no direct contact. Yes, Walter agreed calmly. That was by design. I wanted to ensure the money went to the right people for the right reasons. His gaze hardened slightly. I wanted to see the character of those entrusted with helping veterans like myself. Tonight has been illuminating in that regard. Abraham Stevens stepped forward, taking the document from Richard's unresisting hands. He examined it carefully, then looked up at Walter with newfound respect and no small measure of wonder. The years I spent on the streets weren't wasted, Mr. Stevens, Walter explained, sensing the unasked question. I still had resources, investments my parents had made, royalties from recordings I'd made before my deployment. I chose not to use them for myself. I needed to understand, truly understand, what our veterans face when they fall through the cracks. He turned to address the entire room, his voice gaining strength and purpose. I lived in shelters with men who had commanded platoons in Iraq. I shared meals in soup kitchens with women who had saved lives as combat medics in Afghanistan. I sat in VA waiting rooms with warriors who had given limbs, health, and peace of mind in service to this country. His eyes swept across the elegant crowd. How many of you can say you truly understand what veterans need, not from reports or testimonials, but from lived experience? The silence that followed was profound. Several guests lowered their eyes, discomfort evident in their postures. Walter continued, his tone free of accusation, but firm with conviction. A support center run by people who view veterans as objects of pity or, worse, as inconveniences to be managed will never truly serve its purpose. It needs to be guided by those who understand both the sacrifice and the struggle. Richard Thompson had recovered enough to attempt damage control. Colonel Hayes, while your generosity is appreciated, the organizational structure of the center has already been established. I assure you that as chairman, you are no longer chairman, Mr. Thompson, Walter interrupted, his voice quiet but brooking no argument. As the primary benefactor, I have certain rights outlined in that document, one of which is the ability to remove board members who do not align with the center's mission. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around the room, expressions ranged from shock to, in more than a few cases, poorly concealed satisfaction. Walter turned to Abraham Stevens. Mr. Stevens, your reputation as a fair-minded businessman and longtime advocate for veteran causes precedes you. Would you consider taking on the role of chairman? Abraham appeared momentarily taken aback, but quickly recovered. I would be honored, he said with genuine humility, though I'm not sure I'm the best qualified. You won't be alone, Walter assured him, then turned to where Emily stood, still processing everything she had witnessed. Miss Carter, she supplied automatically. Emily Carter. Miss Carter, Walter continued, I couldn't help noticing the social work textbook in your bag. Your specialization. Emily straightened, professional pride momentarily overcoming her astonishment. Veterans Services, focusing on reintegration and mental health support. Walter nodded approvingly. Theory and practice often exist in different worlds, Miss Carter. Would you be willing to serve as co-chair with Mr. Stevens to bring both your academic knowledge and your evident compassion to this project? Emily's eyes widened. Me? But I'm just a graduate student. I work these events to pay for my education. Precisely, Walter said with the first full smile anyone had seen from him that evening. You understand both worlds. and you were the only person in this room who offered help without judgment when I first arrived." The ballroom had fallen completely silent, every guest riveted by the unfolding drama. Richard Thompson stood frozen, his social and professional standing crumbling before his eyes. Abraham Stevens looked thoughtful, already considering the implications and possibilities of this unexpected turn of events. And Emily Carter, who had arrived that evening as invisible staff and now stood at the center of attention, found herself nodding slowly, determination replacing shock in her expression. "Yes," she said, her voice gathering confidence. "Yes, I would be honored to serve." Walter nodded once, satisfaction evident in his bearing. "Good. Then if you'll excuse me, I believe I was promised a meal in exchange for my playing." The tension in the room broke, scattered laughter and applause rippling through the crowd. Several guests moved forward, eager to speak with the mysterious pianist and hero who had so thoroughly upended their evening. As Walter made his way toward the buffet table, now surrounded by people who had earlier avoided eye contact with him, Richard Thompson slipped quietly toward the exit, his $1,000 bill crumpled forgotten in his pocket. The remainder of the evening unfolded like a dream for Emily. She found herself seated at the head table between Walter and Abraham Stevens, her waitress uniform incongruous among the formal attire surrounding her. The catering manager had been only too happy to relieve her of her duties once the situation became clear. Walter ate methodically, with the disciplined appreciation of someone who understood hunger intimately. Between bites, he answered questions from curious guests with patient grace, neither dwelling on his hardships nor minimizing them. "Will you return to playing professionally?" asked a silver-haired woman who had earlier introduced herself as the director of the Boston Symphony. Walter considered the question. Perhaps, but not as before. He set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. "Music was always my refuge, my truest form of expression. But I think now it might serve a different purpose." "What purpose is that?" Abraham Stevens inquired. Walter's eyes took on a distant quality. "Healing," he said simply. "For myself, and perhaps for others who carry invisible wounds." He glanced at Emily. "Your research must have shown you the therapeutic potential of music for PTSD sufferers." Emily nodded, still somewhat dazed to find herself in this conversation. "The research is promising, especially when combined with other modalities. The Veterans Administration has several pilot programs, often underfunded and oversubscribed." Walter finished for her. "That's something our center might address." Our center. The casual inclusion sent a wave of purpose through Emily. This wasn't a theoretical exercise from one of her classes. This was real opportunity to effect change. As the evening progressed, Emily observed Walter closely. Despite his apparent ease in navigating the social dynamics of the gala, she noticed subtle signs of strain, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes occasionally darted toward exits, his measured breathing when the room grew louder. These were symptoms she had studied, manifestations of hypervigilance that many combat veterans experienced. Yet there was also undeniable strength in his bearing, a resilience that had allowed him to transform profound trauma into purposeful action. In her studies, Emily had learned about post-traumatic growth, the possibility that some individuals might not merely recover from trauma, but find new meaning and purpose through it. Walter Hayes seemed to embody this concept. Across the ballroom, small groups had formed, the earlier social barriers dissolving as guests processed the evening's revelations. Emily overheard fragments of earnest conversations about veteran homelessness, mental health resources, and the failures of existing support systems. "You've changed the entire tenor of this event," she commented to Walter. "People who came for social cachet are now having meaningful discussions about veteran issues." Walter's smile was slight but genuine. "Sometimes people need their assumptions challenged. Comfort breeds complacency." "Is that why you lived on the streets when you had resources?" she asked, then immediately worried she had overstepped. "I'm sorry. That's personal." "It's a fair question," Walter assured her. And yes, partly, but it was also about finding my way back to myself. He glanced around the opulent ballroom. When everything that defined me was stripped away, the acclaim, the music, the military career, I had to discover who remained. And who was that? Abraham Stevens asked quietly, having been listening to their exchange. Walter considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Someone broken, he admitted, but also someone free to choose a new path forward. He looked directly at Emily. That's what many veterans need most. Not just assistance, but agency. The dignity of choosing their own way forward. Emily nodded, understanding dawning. That's why you're restructuring the center's leadership. It's not just about competence, it's about perspective. Precisely, Walter confirmed. The best intentions can lead to harmful approaches if they're not informed by lived experience. He turned to Abraham. Your business acumen will be invaluable, but it's your evident respect for veterans that makes you right for this role. Abraham nodded thoughtfully. My father returned from Vietnam to a country that offered little support and less understanding. I watched him struggle in silence for years. His expression grew determined. I've often wondered what difference it might have made if he'd had access to proper resources. As the evening drew to a close, guests began to depart, many stopping to shake Walter's hand or exchange contact information with Emily and Abraham. The energy in the room had transformed completely. What had begun as a routine social obligation had become the foundation for something meaningful. When only a handful of people remained, Walter rose from his seat. I should be going as well, he said, retrieving his tattered jacket from the back of his chair. Going where? Emily asked before she could stop herself. The thought of this man, this hero who had changed the course of her life in a single evening, returning to the streets was unbearable. Walter seemed to read her concern. Don't worry, Miss Carter. I do have accommodations, modest though they may be. Abraham Stevens cleared his throat. I have a guest house that sits empty most of the year. It's yours for as long as you need it, while we sort out the details of the center. Walter hesitated, and Emily recognized the internal struggle playing across his features, the tension between accepting help and maintaining independence that she had witnessed in many veterans. Consider it a business arrangement, Abraham added perceptively. We have much to discuss in the coming weeks. Proximity would be practical. Walter's posture relaxed slightly. A temporary arrangement, he conceded. Thank you. Emily felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by uncertainty about her own role moving forward. As though sensing her thoughts, Walter turned to her. Miss Carter, I hope you'll join us tomorrow afternoon to begin outlining our vision for the center. Your academic background combined with your evident compassion makes you uniquely qualified. Of course, she replied, professional confidence returning to her voice. I have classes until 3, but I'm available after that. Perfect, Abraham said, already reaching for his phone to make a note. Shall we say 4 o'clock at my office? I'll text you the address. As they exchanged contact information, Emily marveled at how dramatically her life had changed in a few short hours. She had arrived as waitstaff and would leave as co-chair of a multi-million-dollar veteran support initiative. Walter observed the exchange with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in many years, he felt the stirrings of genuine hope, not just for himself, but for the countless veterans whose struggles he had witnessed firsthand. The path ahead would not be without challenges, but it would be purposeful. And after years of drifting, purpose was what he had needed most. 1 month later, Walter stood at the window of Abraham Stevens' guest house, watching the first substantial snowfall of the season blanket the manicured grounds. The transformation from his life on the streets to this peaceful sanctuary had been jarring in ways both expected and surprising. He turned back to the room, his gaze falling on the baby grand piano that Abraham had installed shortly after his arrival. Initially, Walter had objected to what he perceived as unnecessary extravagance, but Abraham had insisted it was a practical necessity for a musician of his caliber. In truth, the instrument had become essential to Walter's ongoing recovery, a bridge between his past and his emerging future. A gentle knock at the door roused him from his contemplation. "Come in," he called, already knowing who it would be. Emily entered, carrying a portfolio and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Over the past weeks, she had shed much of her initial awe, developing a professional rapport with Walter that balanced respect with candid exchange. "The architectural plans arrived this morning," she announced, moving to the small dining table where they often worked. "And the first round of staff interviews is scheduled for next week." Walter joined her at the table, a smile warming his features. "You've accomplished more in a month than most people do in a year." Emily shrugged, though her pride was evident. "It's easier to move quickly when funding isn't an obstacle. And when your co-chair has connections in every corner of Boston society," she added, referring to Abraham's invaluable network. As they reviewed the plans, Walter was once again struck by Emily's intuitive understanding of veterans' needs. The center's design incorporated private spaces for those who struggled with crowded environments, outdoor areas for physical activity, music and art studios for therapeutic expression, and communal spaces designed to foster camaraderie without forcing interaction. "You've integrated every suggestion from our focus groups," he noted, genuinely impressed. "That was the point, wasn't it?" Emily replied. "To create something shaped by actual veterans, not just professional do-gooders." She caught herself. "Not that professional input isn't valuable," Walter chuckled. "Your academic training is invaluable, Emily, but your willingness to listen may be your greater gift." She accepted the compliment with a nod, then hesitated before broaching what was clearly on her mind. "The opening ceremony is in 2 months. Abraham and the board are hoping you'll consider performing." Walter's expression grew contemplative. He had been playing regularly since the night of the gala, but only in private. The prospect of a public performance stirred complicated emotions. "It would be powerful symbolism," Emily continued carefully. "From the pianist of the Ridge to homeless veteran to founder of the center, your journey embodies everything we're trying to accomplish." "I'm not sure I want to be a symbol," Walter said quietly. "Or at least, not only that." Emily studied him with the perceptive gaze that had made her such an effective advocate. "You're concerned about being reduced to a narrative, a neat story of triumph over adversity that glosses over the ongoing reality of recovery." Walter looked at her with newfound appreciation. "Precisely. Then don't let that happen," she said simply. "Use your music to tell the complex truth, just as you did that night at the gala. Not as a finished success story, but as an honest expression of a continuing journey." Walter considered her words, his fingers unconsciously moving as though playing phantom keys. The music had always been his truest voice, even when words failed him. Perhaps it could serve that purpose again, not as performance, but as testimony. "I'll consider it," he said finally. Emily nodded, accepting his response without pushing further. She gathered her papers, moving on to practical matters. "The outreach program starts next week. We have 15 veterans signed up for the initial assessment phase." Walter's expression lightened. This was the aspect of their work that resonated most deeply with him, the direct service to fellow veterans struggling with the transition he understood all too well. "Will Richard Thompson be joining us?" he asked with a hint of wry humor. Emily laughed. "Surprisingly, he's requested to volunteer in a support capacity." At Walter's raised eyebrow, she elaborated. "Apparently, the experience at the gala affected him more than we realized. Or perhaps it was the very public fallout afterward. Either way, he's asked to help with administrative tasks. Under supervision, of course." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Redemption comes in many forms." "Speaking of which," Emily said, her tone shifting to something more personal, "my professor wants to interview you for her research on post-traumatic growth. Only if you're comfortable, of course." Walter's immediate impulse was to decline, but he paused, considering the potential value of sharing his experience. Would it help other veterans? It could, Emily replied honestly. Your story challenges many assumptions about recovery paths. It's not linear, it's not always about returning to who you were before, and sometimes the greatest growth comes from the darkest places. Walter was silent for a moment, thinking of the mountains of Afghanistan, the streets of Boston, and all the paths that had led him to this moment. Tell your professor I'm willing to speak with her, he decided. Not as an inspirational story, but as one possible journey among many. Emily's smile was warm with understanding. That's exactly what makes it valuable. As she prepared to leave, Emily paused at the door. Oh, and the Boston Symphony called again. The director is quite persistent about that guest performance. Walter shook his head, amused by the director's determination. One step at a time. The center comes first. After Emily departed, Walter returned to the piano. His fingers found the keys without conscious direction, beginning the composition he had played at the gala, the piece that had revealed his identity to Abraham Stevens. As the music filled the room, Walter reflected on the strange circular journey that had brought him here. He had gone from acclaimed pianist to decorated soldier to homeless veteran to philanthropist, each identity containing elements of truth without encompassing the whole. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the ground in a pristine blanket that transformed the landscape. Walter played on, his music evolving as he worked through the composition, adding new elements that spoke of his recent experiences, of connection regained, of purpose rediscovered, of healing not as a destination, but as an ongoing process. In 2 months, he would play for the opening of the Veteran Support Center, not as the triumphant hero returned from the wilderness, but as a fellow traveler on a complicated journey of recovery. His music would speak the truth that words often failed to capture, that healing was not linear, that strength could emerge from vulnerability, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in everyday moments of choosing to move forward. The piece reached its conclusion, the final notes lingering in the air like a question awaiting an answer. Walter sat motionless for a moment, then began again, this time improvising something entirely new, a composition that would tell not just his story, but the collective story of all those the center aimed to serve. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape into something both familiar and new. Inside, Walter Hayes, pianist, soldier, survivor, benefactor, created music that did the same, reshaping pain into purpose and isolation into connection. The center would not solve every problem or heal every wound, but it would offer something that Walter had sought during his darkest days on the streets, recognition of dignity beyond circumstance, and the space to reclaim one's story on one's own terms. As twilight descended, casting the snow-covered grounds in shades of blue and purple, Walter played on. The music flowed not just from his fingers, but from every experience that had shaped him. The applause of concert halls, the brotherhood of soldiers, the silence of mountain ridges, the harsh lessons of the streets, and now, the cautious hope of new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring meetings and decisions, practical matters and bureaucratic challenges. But tonight, there was only the music, speaking truths that transcended words, building bridges across experiences that seemed unbridgeable, and affirming that even the most fractured life could find harmony again. When Walter finally ended his improvisation, the room fell silent save for the faint ticking of a clock and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows. He closed the piano lid gently, a sense of completion settling over him. Not an ending, but a milestone on a continuing journey. He rose from the bench and walked to the window, watching as the last light of day faded from the snow-covered landscape. For the first time in many years, Walter Hayes looked toward the future not with dread or resignation, but with purpose. The Veterans Support Center would open its doors in 2 months. And he would be there, not as a symbol, but as himself, complex, imperfect, still healing, but moving forward. One day, one note, one step at a time. If you've been moved by Walter's journey from the streets to redemption, please support our channel by subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary symphonies come from the most unexpected places.